Hi folks, and welcome to our video on Rick Altman's landmark essay, A Semantic Syntactic Approach to Film Genre. This is one of the most cited theoretical essays on what genre is and how we should think about genre within film studies. It was written in 1984 and it's part of many edited collections within film studies. So the major argument of the essay is pretty simple, though the essay itself is rather difficult. If I were to summarize the basic goal of the essay, I would say it's something like this. Altman argues that a majority of genre scholarship fundamentally misunderstands the nature of genre, and he proposes that a, quote, semantic syntactic approach can clear things up. What I want to do first that Rick Altman doesn't do is actually explain what those words semantic and syntactic mean. Altman very much assumes that his reader is familiar with these terms, which are borrowed from linguistics, or the study of language. But instead of assuming that you know what they mean, I want to briefly explain what they mean from their original discipline, the study of language. So when I'm talking about semantics, I'm talking about the meaning of a sentence or an utterance. Let's look at a few examples of a change in a sentence that retains the syntax, which is the structure of the sentence or grammar of the sentence, but changes the meaning. So I start with the sentence, the film explores themes of isolation and identity, and I change it to the film critiques societal norms surrounding isolation and identity. Very similar sentence structure, which you can see from this color coding, but the meaning has fundamentally changed. We have a subject, the film, a verb, explores or critiques. We have an object of that verb, themes or societal norms. And then we have a prepositional phrase or modifier attached to that object of isolation and identity or surrounding isolation and identity. Notice all the ways in which I could retain the basic syntax of the sentence, but change the semantics by just replacing some of those parts of speech with different words that maintain the same structure. Societal norms surrounding love and marriage. I could say the teacher hates movies about friendship and family. I could even change the semantics just by italicizing or emphasizing a word in my utterance of the sentence. For example, the semantics or meaning of the sentence, the film explores themes of isolation and identity, is quite different from the sentence, the film explores themes of isolation and identity, where it sounds like I'm responding to a claim that the film explores identity and something contrary to isolation, like community. Now let's look at a couple examples of a sentence that changes the syntax, but kind of retains the same basic meaning or semantics. So the film explores themes of isolation and identity, changed to themes of isolation and identity are explored by the film. The meaning is basically the same, but you'll notice a different kind of structure or syntax. From an active construction, now it's a passive construction. I start with the object, and then I end with the subject. Another way of thinking about the distinction between semantics and syntax in linguistics is to give you two sentences that each get semantics wrong and syntax wrong. So a famous sentence coined by Noam Chomsky, a famous linguist and social thinker, that is semantically nonsensical but syntactically correct is something like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. It fits the rules of subject, verb, object in English perfectly, but it really can't make sense of that sentence. On the contrary, take a sentence like the cat, the mat, on, sat. I recognize all the words, but I can tell that something is off in terms of how those words are arranged. They don't quite have the right syntax or structure to follow the recognizable rules of English grammar. So overall, when we're talking about semantics, we're talking about meaning in a sentence or utterance, and syntax, we're talking about structure or grammar. Now, how do these categories of semantics and syntax apply to film genre? Rick Altman wants to say that an awful lot of theories of genre might be described as relying on either semantic understandings of genre or syntactic theories or understandings of genre. So what does that look like? It's really in the explanation of what a semantic and syntactic dimension of film genre looks like. That is the essence of this essay. So when genre theorists are primarily and implicitly adopting a semantic understanding of genre, they are, he says, quote, using generic definitions that depend on a list of common traits, characters, shots, locations, sets, and the like. In other words, they're equating a genre with the building blocks of that genre. So Altman will quote one theorist who he thinks has a semantic understanding of genre, who kind of gives us a list of the kinds of things that we'll see in a Western, right? An emphasis on earth, dust, water, and leather, a tough cowboy, a soft cowboy, a lonely sheriff, faithful or treacherous Indian, and even particular stylistic tropes like the fast tracking shots or crane shots. To kind of relate this back to the linguistic metaphor where the word semantic comes from, let's go back to that sentence we looked at. The teacher hates movies about friendship and family. It's almost as if these theorists of genre are saying that the essence of that sentence is just the cluster of words that appear in that sentence. Hate, movies, teacher, friendship, family. Another way of thinking about it is that it's almost like these theorists are treating a genre like a collection of items, irrespective of how those items are arranged. So think about it like a Western themed Lego set, right? You have little guys with cowboy hats, you have guys with six shooters, you have horses, you have cactus, you have all those little pieces that you see when you watch a Western movie, right? In film studies, you might call these objects of mise-en-scène, the things that are in front of the camera. But importantly, Altman also says that you can list stylistic or formal attributes. Those are still part of the semantic dimension, right? Fast tracking shots, crane shots, and I might add what I think is one of the most common formal techniques of the Western is a slow pan across a desert vista, like you see here. So that's the semantic dimension. What's the syntactic dimension? Altman says that there are other genre theorists who implicitly define genre differently. So he quotes a couple of folks who define the genre of Western in a slightly different way. Check it out. Quote, "The Western grows out of a dialectic between the West as garden and as desert, between culture and nature, community and individual, future and past." And quote, "The Western takes place on the border between two lands, between two eras, and with a hero who remains divided between two value systems." Notice that these articulations are not objects, but are something closer to what we might call theme. And a theme can only emerge once you've considered a story and what that story means, right? You cannot deduce these themes from a bunch of objects like cactuses and cowboy hats and locations and times, like the American West in the 19th century. So we might say that instead of defining the genre according to the individual pieces within the Lego set, these syntactic folks are defining the genre of the Western by how those Lego pieces are arranged into a story. And they are saying that there are particular patterns across the stories that are told in Western films that are the essence of the genre. Or to go back to that linguistic metaphor, we are no longer defining the essence of that sentence in terms of the collection of words. We are saying the essence only emerges from the sentence that is the arrangement of those words within a particular order. So Altman says that, hey, these approaches to defining genre are pretty different, and each has their own advantages and disadvantages. He acknowledges that the semantic approach has broad applicability, right? If I see any of those elements within the Lego set, the cowboy hat, the American West, the 19th century, the horse, the lasso, I feel confident that I can say that film is a Western. But what I don't have is the deeper meanings that might be gleaned from actually watching the kind of stories that are typical of a film that we call a Western. In other words, we lack what he calls explanatory power. The syntactic folks can answer the question, what is the Western about? Or what values does the Western reflect? So what's the problem with there being two distinct understandings of genre? Has Altman done enough by just pointing out that there are these two patterns within genre scholarship, and now he's revealed a particular distinction that folks might have not been aware of? Well, no, he wants to go a bit further. He wants to say that, quote, "Many arguments centering on generic problems have arisen only when semantic and syntactic theoreticians have simply talked past each other, each unaware of the other's divergent orientation." So he wants to say that a lot of arguments will emerge, unproductive arguments, because these theorists don't realize that they have completely different understandings of what, at bottom, a genre is. And he gives, I think, a pretty clear example. He says, what do we make of this subgenre that people have called the Pennsylvania Western? Pennsylvania Western is basically a movie that takes place in the 18th century around the American Revolution, that in many ways feels like a Western, but it doesn't take place in the American West in the 19th century, which we might think is one of the most important defining elements of the Western. If you're a semantic genre theorist, you would say that, hey, it's pretty clear that these are not Westerns, right? Henry Fonda is wearing the wrong type of hat. This is in the wrong century, the 18th century rather than the 19th century, and it's in the wrong location, not the American West, but the American Northeast. But the syntactic folks will definitely recognize this as a Western. Altman says, quote, "These films construct plots and develop a frontier structure clearly derived from decades of Western novels and films." So with this example, Altman is basically arguing that the syntactic and semantic approaches should be combined. We should always understand that a genre is always the combination of syntactic and semantic elements. And he makes another great point to support this. He says, quote, "It is simply not possible to describe Hollywood cinema accurately without the ability to account for the numerous films that innovate by combining the syntax of one genre with the semantics of another." So I think one of the most famous examples of this, which he only mentions briefly, is the first Star Wars film. Star Wars clearly has the semantics of science fiction, right? It has futuristic weapons, it has space aliens, it has interstellar space travel. But as many critics have noted, it also has the syntactic elements of the Western, right? Outer space as a lawless frontier. The rebellion might be conceived as a revolt against oppressive forces. The lightsaber battles are kind of like duels in a Western. And there are even indigenous groups like the Ewoks or the Sand People who are resisting invaders. And of course, it's not right to say that there aren't semantic elements borrowed from the Western, right? Like the cantinas at Tatooine very much resemble saloons. It's just to say that many films are like Star Wars, borrowing various elements from genres that might be clarified by being divided into semantic dimensions and syntactic dimensions. So in his comment on Star Wars, Altman says this: "By maintaining simultaneous descriptions according to both semantics and syntax, we are not likely to fall into the trap of equating Star Wars with the Western, as numerous recent critics have done, even though it shares certain syntactic patterns with that genre." Right? So just as it's important to recognize that there are indeed Western elements of Star Wars, it's equally important not to say that, oh, therefore, Star Wars is really a Western. No, it just has syntactic elements of the Western. And to further clarify Altman's point, it has semantic and syntactic elements borrowed from elsewhere. For example, the major plot line of the first Star Wars film borrows largely from the mythical structure of the hero's journey, which we might see in some Westerns, but certainly not all of them. It doesn't define the Western, nor does it belong to the sci-fi genre. And there are plenty of semantic elements like the Force or the importance of prophecies in the Star Wars universe that are neither markedly sci-fi nor Western, but something closer to maybe fantasy. To use another example that Altman doesn't mention, consider the 1979 film Alien by Ridley Scott. It heavily contains the semantics of sci-fi with space aliens and spaceships. And as many critics have noted, it has a lot of the syntactical elements of the slasher horror film, right? There's a group isolated in a space that it can't escape. A monster is eliminating them one by one, and we're left with a final girl of Ripley who has to fight the monster alone. But I think following his point about Star Wars, Altman would also say that while it's important to recognize that Alien has a lot in common with a slasher horror film, or frankly, what would become the slasher horror film, it's not right to say that it's truly a slasher horror film, because you can say that there are plenty of syntactic elements that are strictly sci-fi, right? The movie is about a speculative future dominated by technology and capitalism. It shows us humanity's encounter with the unknown in the form of alien life. And thematically, it's about the corporate and scientific interests that override ethical concerns. These feel like very much dystopian sci-fi elements. At the same time, there are plenty of semantic elements, that is, things that we see, the items in the film, the stuff in the film, that is squarely in the horror genre, right? The alien is not just an alien, it's also a monster. That is very scary. And there's plenty of body horror in the film, like the chest bursting scene. So I think one of the main takeaways from this way of thinking is to get away from this idea that a film is really one genre, or that in saying that a film resembles a genre that it might not ostensibly belong to, you are revealing some truth about that film. Like this title of an article about the much discussed status of Die Hard as a Christmas movie, right? 9 reasons why Die Hard is really a Christmas film. Altman would not be against all the points that this article makes. He'd be against the idea of saying it is really a Christmas film. No, it's a film that has plenty of elements, semantic and syntactic, borrowed from the action genre, and it has plenty of elements, both semantic and syntactic, from the Christmas film genre. So how else does the combined semantic syntactic approach address problems in the study of genre? So here I want to acknowledge that this question is really the framing of this paper. The paper starts with this question and ends with this question, and only gets to defining the semantic and syntactic dimensions in the middle of the paper. The paper actually begins by saying that there are 3 contradictions in genre study that present a kind of logical problem that Altman is trying to solve. So what are those contradictions? And this is actually the tougher part of the paper. That's why I left it to the end. The first contradiction he calls the problem of corpus. A corpus is just a body of work. The contradiction comes from 2 different ways of thinking about how we answer the question, which films count as a given genre. For example, which films count as musicals? And there's two basic approaches. The first approach is the inclusive approach. It's to say that, well, a musical is just any film that has a bunch of diegetic songs with it. That is, songs that are not just playing over the movie, but songs that are being sung by characters in the movie. There will be other critics who will respond to these folks and say, no, no, no. The truest musicals are X, Y, and Z, or the most archetypal or the most essential musicals. The musicals that best get at the essence of what a musical is. Altman is saying that there are critics for whom it is not enough to simply list a bunch of elements, right? They want to imply that to be a member of a group, you have to kind of embody the essence of that group. So you can see a kind of contradiction here. These people can't agree on the criteria for what makes a movie a musical. But I think you'll see pretty clearly the nature of the contradiction. The semantic and syntactic distinction actually really helps us out here. The first group, the inclusive approach, is just demonstrating a semantic understanding of genre, a fairly superficial series of elements that a film has to have to be included. And the exclusive folks are largely just using a syntactic approach to genre, right? If the exclusive critic says that the movie Singin' in the Rain embodies the essence of the musical, they're going to draw on the richness of the story, how the parts are arranged, how certain themes emerge in order to make that case. They are syntactical theorists at their heart. So there's really not a contradiction here, just a misunderstanding about the nature of the musical as necessitating both semantic and syntactic dimensions. Let's look at the second contradiction that Altman talks about. He calls this genre theory versus genre history. Basically, he says that there are genre theorists who are trying to define the essence of the genre, isolate how it works, understand how it works, analyze how it works. But in order to theorize the essence of a thing, you sort of have to take a snapshot of it in time and ignore the ways that things change throughout history. This is definitionally opposed to what a genre historian will do, who wants to relay the ways in which genres develop and change over time in particular ways. So Altman asks this question. We have this problem. How do we theorize the nature of a genre while also accounting for how it changes over time? Well, his answer is to say that if you look at genres closely, you will realize that there are two basic ways in which genres change over time that can be understood as emerging out of a relationship between the semantic and the syntactic elements. So the first way that he says that genres change over time is that they start with a given set of semantic elements and then syntax starts to build over time. Here's his example. He says, quote, from the 1927 to 1930 period to the 1930s, the musical began to grow in a new direction while maintaining substantially the same semantic materials like diegetic songs, the inclusion of nightclubs, or the emphasis on show business as its subject matter. The genre increasingly related the energy of music making to the joy of coupling, the strength of the community, and the pleasures of entertainment. So he's saying when the first movie musicals emerged, and they emerged with the coming of sound film, like in 1927 with The Jazz Singer, they had moments where the movie's plot was suspended by a diegetic song, and they also, he says, tended to be films that depicted the putting on of a show. But they didn't have the thematic elements that we would start to identify with the musical that really blossomed in the 1930s with the Busby Berkeley musicals like 42nd Street or the Fred Astaire Ginger Roger musicals of the 30s like Top Hat. It's only then that we get the syntactic elements that relate the energy of music making to the joy of coupling and the strength of community and the pleasures of entertainment, right? So we start with individual elements, and over time, those elements start to be put into a familiar kind of order that yields familiar set of themes and values. But there's also a situation that's kind of the reverse, where you start with syntax and you alter the semantic dimension. So here's his example. He says, films like All Through the Night and Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror simply transfer to a new set of semantic elements the righteous cops punish criminals syntax that the gangster genre of the early 30s had turned to starting with G-Men. So he makes a really smart point here. He's talking about films that in the midst of World War II are villainizing the Germans and the Japanese, which many critics would point to history to explain. Of course, American films are going to villainize the Axis powers. But what those historical critics are not understanding is how the basic plot structure that sets up the Germans and Japanese as villains actually resembles an earlier genre structure, a structure in which cops are punishing criminals, which is a syntactic structure. It's a structure of narrative. So you can say that these World War II films are sort of like gangster films because they retain the same syntax. And you could argue that they are part of the long history of the gangster film. So Altman's broader point here is to say that you can do theory and history at the same time by borrowing from these concepts of the syntactic and the semantic and showing how they're always interrelated. So let's look at the third contradiction, which is maybe the most complicated, but I kind of think one of the most interesting. It's the ritual versus ideological interpretation contradiction. And this contradiction comes from critics who are essentially asking this same question: why are genres popular? There are two major contradictory answers to this question. The genre as ritual folks will say that genres are popular because they reflect the audience's inherent desires or fantasies. We watch Westerns because they tap into some shared feeling about the frontier and exploration, or we watch horror films because they tap into a shared anxiety that I want to cathartically express by watching it on screen. This kind of theory is giving a lot of agency to the audience, insofar as it's saying that the horror and the Western genre are popular because they satisfy something that audiences want. But the other camp is way more skeptical. This is the genre as ideology camp. They say that genres are fully created by the culture industry in order to manipulate us. And this kind of thinking is pretty consistent with the major ways of thinking about film theory in the 1970s. These folks are going to say that genres are, after all, mass cultural forms created by a profit-driven system, the classical Hollywood system, which has rightly been described as a dream factory. And so we shouldn't see these films as reflecting our desires so much as manufacturing our desires in a manner that aligned with the profit-driven interests of corporate Hollywood. So how do we address this contradiction? Well, here's Altman's rather simple answer. He says that if you really think about it, Hollywood genres are equally and simultaneously ritual and ideological. That is, he says, quote, the most successful genres reside in a region where the audience's ritual values coincide with Hollywood's ideological ones. In other words, it's the merger of these two elements that makes a genre successful, right? The audience is getting what they want. That's why they keep desiring the same thing. But at the same time, these things are made by Hollywood and are inevitably going to reflect the values of the people that make them and perpetuate the ideology of the corporation that needs to maintain a certain status quo. And Altman will also note that the most successful genres can be identified, quote, whenever a semantic genre becomes a syntactic one, right? He's sort of implying that there's a certain satisfaction that comes not just from seeing the same types of things on screen, like, hey, I want to see cowboy hats, or I want to see horses, or I want to see spaceships, and I want to see space aliens. But no, the real kind of genre satisfaction, the satisfaction of my movie-going expectation, only happens when those semantic cues start to be funneled into particular kinds of stories, which have particular kinds of themes and reflect particular kinds of values. That's when a genre gets deep, and in its depth, that's how it seeps into the desires of audiences. So Altman's broader point is to say that it was never either ritual or ideological, but each of these kinds of critics has an important point to make. The truth is that genre as a phenomenon is equal parts ritual and ideological. And this leads to a broader point that he's trying to make throughout the entire paper. And this is what I want to end with. He says early on in the paper that if we have learned anything from post-structuralist criticism, we have learned not to fear logical contradictions, but instead to respect the extraordinary energy generated by the play of contradictory forces within a field. Just like semantic and syntactic are not opposed categories, but dimensions that affect each other, so too are each of these contradictions: ritual versus ideological, theory versus history, inclusive versus exclusive approach to corpus, made up of seemingly contradictory categories that are actually two parts of a whole that always affect each other. Okay, and I think I'll end things there with the semantic syntactic approach to film genre. I will see you next time.